The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Welcome back to our next episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author. And believe it or not, we are actually in part 2 of a 3-part series. The last episode that we had started off with our friends at Greenwood Whiskey. I was able to finally try some. It is utterly phenomenal. Definitely jump on their website and order yourself a bottle because it's fantastic. And we've got some more whiskeys coming down the pipeline. So if you haven't followed us on social media, now's the time to do it. Regardless, Tom Magadino from Pizzeria Magadino, which not only has food trucks in the Fort Lauderdale area, but they are also the house kitchen at Gulf Stream Brewing. And that is who we are going to be speaking to today. Actually, today and our next episode. So this ends up being part 2 of a 3-part series all about Gulf Stream. Obviously, the first part was the kitchen and the amazing pizza that Tom and his team are making. Today, we're going to be talking about the brewery. Gulf Stream Brewery, the first one that was in the building and that you can find pretty much all around town, and even partnering with the city of Fort Lauderdale to make their official beer, Everything Under the Sun. We spoke to Ty Eriks, who, along with his wife, Sherry, co-founded and co-own Gulf Stream Brewery. Ty's got an interesting day job, let me tell you that. And then we also sat down with Noah Aguilar. He is the co-founder of Gulf Stream Distilling, which we are going to be talking about on our final episode of the 3-part series. And we also spoke to, interestingly enough, being able to sort of kind of go between the two, Daniel Kastner. He is the head distiller at Gulf Stream Distilling. He also is the native-born Fort Lauderdale-ish. I don't know what you would call somebody who was born and raised in Fort Lauderdale, and also spent several years at Tarpon River Brewing, most notably 4 of them as their head brewer. But he is distilling now, and we were able to sit down with Daniel and Noah and Ty, who you're going to hear from quite a bit in this episode, to talk about the formation of one of the big breweries here in Fort Lauderdale. It's been a long time coming. I've been super excited to get them on the podcast, and I'm very happy that it has finally happened, and there's a lot to get through. So enough about me. Gulf Stream Brewing, let's enjoy. Let's wind back the clock quite a bit before Gulf Stream was what it is now. Where exactly were you, and how did you approach, hey, let's manufacture and sell and distribute alcoholic beverages for fun and profit?
Yeah. Well, I started brewing beer in Boston, Massachusetts. I went to dental school at Boston University. And
a big difference between the two.
I still am a dentist. I have a couple practices. And my wife is the GM here, so she's here on a day-to-day basis. But so long story short, we were just poor kids in Boston that couldn't go to bars. And I had a buddy of mine that knew how to make beer. And we started making very mediocre beer to begin with, and just over the 4 years of dental school started doing more and more and more batches and got better and better and better. And after school I ended up moving back to Seattle and meeting my old business partner that I started the brewery with here, and we went through all the processes and going through, making business plans and all that, recipes and all that stuff. And I moved out here for dentistry, and we were originally going to open up the brewery in Portland. And I convinced him to move out here, and we got this building in 2016.
So you were in Boston for school. originally from the Seattle area.
Yes, sir.
Why did you decide to come down to Florida for the practice to begin with? It seems like, especially Fort Lauderdale, Seattle's a slightly bigger area.
So I did a residency down here when I was a fourth-year dental student, and my wife and I just fell in love with the area. I had spent a little bit of time down here in college playing college football, and I fell in love with the area and knew I wanted to live down here eventually, and so it was a stepping stone for my wife and I, and we just, instead of putting roots back into Seattle, we decided to come down here and start our professional career.
That's amazing. Gentlemen.
All right.
Are you are any of you from the area? Is anybody from this area?
No. Is anybody really from?
Is anybody ever from? Oh, you are?
Yeah, I'm
okay.
born and raised here in Fort Lauderdale.
Well, good for you. Congratulations. Yeah.
We got one.
We got one.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're born and raised in Fort Lauderdale, what has it been like watching the area grow up? Or were you here in downtown Fort Lauderdale?
I grew up like in the almost like uptown Fort Lauderdale area, over by Executive Airport.
Okay.
So just outside of downtown Fort Lauderdale, but close enough where I was here regularly in downtown.
That's awesome. Yeah. And then,
So, I'm a chef by trade. That's how I started off. I came to Fort Lauderdale to be a yacht chef about in 2008. And so I've been on boats for the last 16 years. Actually, the whole experience of this whole thing and the culmination of how we got together was I was cooking for a family out in the Abacos. I was introduced with, hey, have you ever made moonshine? And I said, well, no. And he's like, well, I've got a still. And then, do you want to give it a crack? And I was like, why not? Never really thought about it. 2 weeks later, I show up to my house, and there's a small 5-gallon still sitting in my front yard. And so I was like, okay, well, never done it before. And I was like, how hard can it be? It's extremely hard.
all I can see is a still with a big bow and a sign that says, don't tell the cops.
yeah. No, the irony was just that it was just sitting right on my front porch for the whole world to see. I show up from work, it's sitting on my front porch. I go, well, I guess this is happening. So here we go. I understand fermentation. I do a lot of fermentation with the breads that I make and a lot of the stuff in my food. So I thought, okay, how difficult can it be to extract the alcohol from this? But to actually make a good product, it took about 6 months and about 14 different books that I read just to understand the process itself. And that's really how it got started. I mean, I'm still a chef, and I'm still a chef on a yacht.
So actually that leads me to a number of different questions that I do want to talk about. And we will talk about the culinary aspect of craft beverages. But Fort Lauderdale, more so than any city in coastal Florida, both sides, seems to be very strongly yacht culture. Not beach culture. You go to Daytona, it's beach culture. You go to Tampa, the St. Pete, it's got a different vibe, but it's still slightly different. Whereas Fort Lauderdale seems to be sort of yacht culture. And I
want to kind of amend that with saying
I think
it's more of a party culture. I think MTV sort of promoted that in the very beginning, as far as like the spring break and the elbow room and all the iconic places that are down here in Fort Lauderdale that promote. I mean, come on, guys. We consider ourselves Fort Liquordale, really. Is the bottom line.
Fact.
Well, we should go to the resident. When you were born here, did you have a bottle of tequila?
So my family life was a little bit different. None of my family drank at all, and it wasn't until I started making booze underage that I got started with it.
We're just going down a rabbit hole.
It's going to be a weird podcast.
I think we all started in some sort of illegal activities when we were younger.
Right, exactly.
But I guess, has Fort Lauderdale been able to cultivate and keep that spring break vibe going, or have things changed a little bit?
Well, I think it's changed a little bit for sure.
A little bit, yeah, but I mean, spring break this year was pretty crazy.
Well, that's it.
Since they kicked everyone out of Miami,
Miami put a lot of restrictions on like a lot of spring breakers, and they just moved north and came up here and spent a lot more time up here and a lot more people up here. So I think it's evolving to be a little bit crazier than it used to be honest.
Well, I mean, the liquor culture in this town, the beer and liquor culture in this town is just in some senses have been consistent, actually, since the Prohibition times. And that's why we like to focus on that. And that's kind of the Gulf Stream era. It's like, you had all of the rum runners coming over from Bimini into this area. And we really enjoy the fact that we want to expose people to the history of Fort Lauderdale before it gets lost. Because, everybody's coming down here, everybody's moving up north.
Yep.
But the rum runners are coming over from Bimini because it's so close. Then they would transport it downriver and hit the trains, and it would hit different vehicles at that point that would ship it up north. So you're bringing in a product that was worth, how much was the bag back then? It was like,
I can't remember the prices, but
let's say $20 for 5 bottles of booze at that stage. And then by the time it hit New York, it was $80. So you're looking at this huge hub that was down here that people don't really understand how significant we were during the Prohibition area. And you had Al Capone he had a house in Stiltsville where they're doing illegal gambling.
Really?
Yeah. And they were rum running, and all that sort of transpired from this point and then got brought up north. So I think I really want to express the history of Fort Lauderdale in that sense, that we were very significant to the illegal sales of booze since back in the day.
Interesting. So you've got, I guess, was it the party scene? Was it the sort of historical aspect of Fort Lauderdale loving alcohol that said, this really is the place? Or was it your interest in being here anyways because you loved it?
Anyway, to be absolutely honest with you. And I still think Fort Lauderdale is a good clip behind the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast in terms of the beer scene. So we wanted to kind of get in on the beginning aspects. I mean, again, it was here before us for sure, but I mean, towards the beginning of the ride with craft beer in Fort Lauderdale and become part of, the Fort Lauderdale beer culture as much as possible.
So when you decided to open up Gulf Stream, what was the Fort Lauderdale beer scene like? Because you are correct, it's a little bit. Yeah. It's not as vibrant as some people would say, and
I think we have great breweries in Fort Lauderdale. So I think when we started, obviously Funky Buddha was up the street. That's not Fort Lauderdale proper, but it's Oakland Park. And we had Tarpon. You guys opened right before we did, right?
Yeah. So before this, I was the head brewer at Tarpon.
Yeah. You with
Adam Fine and all that.
Yeah. Well, Adam, if there's anybody who's a fixture of Fort Lauderdale beer, it's Adam Fine. Yeah.
He's the godfather of craft beer.
Absolutely.
For Florida.
100%.
Yeah, I kind of feel like Adam is to Fort Lauderdale what Fran Andrulovich is to Palm Beach County.
Yeah.
Opening to Cuesta.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And an absolute solid dude.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. Yeah.
But we also had, when did Three Sons open? That was pretty close around there, too.
I thought Three Sons opened after you.
Yeah, they were after us, but not far. Not far, maybe a year.
Yeah, not that.
Just 6 months. Yeah. The Lauderdale was there, too. But, there's definitely been, and Invasive, too, was open around the same time. Yeah.
There's been Mac House. They've been open forever, but it's a smaller little place.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, there was a good beer scene here for sure. And I think we've all kind of done really well making great beers and bringing people down to Fort Lauderdale area from outside of Broward County to experience the beer scene here. So
absolutely.
I think it's a phenomenal beer scene. It's ever changing and it's growing, which is pretty phenomenal in this market.
Yeah, exactly. And it is kind of widespread, and you've got some distance between them. So the building that we're in right now, what was it about this location? We are in Fort Lauderdale, but I'd say we're maybe skipping distance to Wilton Manors, Oakland Park, those kind of areas. What was it about this area in general and this building specifically?
It's funny that you asked that question because I used to work at a dental practice up the street off of Florinata, and we used to drive down here and go to lunch at Milk Money, before it was Milk Money, called Warsaw Coffee Company. So we used to go there, grab coffee, grab a sandwich, and then go back to work. So we drove by this building for years. And I always said, that'd be a great place for a brewery. It'd be great, just the size of the building, the area, the fact that 13th Street was building up, kind of getting at the beginnings of the businesses coming into this corridor. And then I convinced my business partner to look at coming out here, and then I reached out, and it all kind of fell into place.
Now, obviously, you weren't the first in Fort Lauderdale, as you said. How difficult was it to work with the city and the county in sort of...
That's an excellent question.
And that's why I asked it.
So again, we have to take this out of the podcast, but no, absolute honestly, they were, not really, they didn't really know what they were doing, I don't think, when it came to breweries and
which is interesting because you weren't the first in the city.
Right, but we were pretty close, right? And we all kind of were going through permitting and all that at the same time. And I may have started before all these others. It took us 2 years to get this thing permitted and licensed to be able to sell our first pint of beer. So we leased this building in August or September of 2016 and didn't open until September of 2018.
And that's got to be difficult for investors and whatnot to show, hey, we're going to do something, but it's not our fault.
I promise you it's going to happen. It's more my wife than anybody. Like, dude, really this is happening right now? 2 years, buddy?
So, obviously, you mentioned, we'll talk about the clientele later, but when you go into both the Vibe, which is phenomenal, it's one of my family and I absolute favorite places in the state of Florida, let's be perfectly honest.
Awesome, thank you.
But you take a look, there's some breweries that you mentioned that are very specific on one style of beer. You take a look at some other places, Funky Buddha really is up the road, and that's the building that Maple Bacon Coffee Porter built.
Yes.
When you decide, okay, we're going to open, what is that vision? What is that style? What are you going for in terms of here's the kind of brewery that we are?
We've always wanted to kind of bridge the gap between the macro breweries and like the super craft breweries, right? Make super drinkable, crushable, outdoor Florida lifestyle craft beers, right? So clean, crisp, not crazy high alcohol, that kind of stuff. And that's more focused towards our distribution platform. Of course, we make a bunch of different stuff in the tap room and all that. Clearly, 13% stout right there. But our business profile in terms of outside of these four walls is that. So,
well, actually, that's a great question. When you opened, were you really focused more on distro or focused on getting people into the tap room?
No, getting people in the tap room. For sure. Yeah.
And when you do that, do you tend, only because I know that a lot, obviously we're very close to a very busy port and there's a lot of cruise ships that come in here. Do you try to focus on getting that crowd in, the spring break crowd in maybe, or do you really focus on locals?
Yep.
It's always locals.
Always locals.
Always locals.
That's our focus as well. It's
100%.
Like, we're all about the Fort Lauderdale people that are here all the time.
Yeah.
And
which is difficult because we have a lot of snowbirds here as well. I mean, we're very close to where the Quebecois tend to come during the winter.
I'll be honest with you. I don't think I think that is a shift in this environment that has changed significantly since the COVID.
Yeah.
We have a lot more residents down here than ever before. I could tell you 10 years ago I could ride my scooter around tonight and it'd be a ghost town. Whereas I was driving through hectic traffic today and probably gotten almost 3 accidents. So
interesting. I
also
didn't realize that.
Oh, and I can't say that. Snowbirds that are full-time residents, yes, they're not the best drivers sometimes. I'm not going to name a location, but I think we all know what we're talking about.
I don't think we need to.
I mean, honestly, I used to look at the seasons here in Fort Lauderdale. It's like as soon as the blue hairs showed up, I'd be like, oh, it's winter. Other than that now.
Oh, God,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I had an aunt and uncle that snowbirded in Boca.
Yeah.
Just as...
Dan, you've been here the longest, man. How do you feel about this new transition of all the people that are coming in?
Traffic always sucks. Doesn't matter.
No, let's get your honest opinion. Yeah.
But at least it's not as bad as Miami.
I've been commuting to downtown
that's true.
Lauderdale since college for jobs over in the area, so it's always been shit. It's, as far as traffic goes.
Yeah.
It just is what it is.
Interesting. So when it came to the tap list, obviously you're trying to do a spread of things. Did you ever... And I've had some breweries say yes and some say no. Did you ever decide, hey, this is going to be our signature? This is going to be the beer that we're known for? Or did you decide to go the exact opposite direction and say,
no, we kind of tailored the beers that we do our major distribution with. We tailored those for distribution purposes mainly. just because I think it speaks to more of the masses than some of the other more niche beers, you know.
And I was going to say, if you were going to mass produce a beer for distribution in Broward County, what is that beer going to look like? What's going to sell the best?
Our American Light Lager is and our Graphic Hybrid IPA are the two that really do the best in distribution. Publix just picked up Graphic, actually.
Oh, congratulations!
250 locations. And Total Wine, Fresh Market, Whole Foods, Hold My Beer, and Graphic. So we have a good distribution platform, and it's ever changing. It's getting bigger, which is great.
Yeah.
It's a great problem to have. So
exactly, especially since I've had so many breweries saying since COVID, everything has changed, and it's been more and more difficult to have distribution and to have a tap room. How have you been able to stay solid and relevant since the pandemic ended?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the locals, I think really during the pandemic, this neighborhood was very good to us. They supported us. They were here. We had drive-through thing, and people came and made sure that they got what they wanted to get, and pizzas included. We did kind of half-baked pies that were vacuum packed and all that people could pick up with beers and take home. And ever since then, I mean, just the local community is growing, right? Because more and more local people are finding out about us. And it is kind of hidden back here on 13th Street. It's not like it's on Federal or anything like that. So it's not like you accidentally drive by easily. So in terms of that, it is a slow grower. But, yeah, I mean, I think that is the biggest portion of the population that helps us grow, and in this environment, helps us continually grow at a clip that keeps us healthy.
Awesome. And one of the interesting things is that obviously, the city of Fort Lauderdale, when you were opening, when you were permitting, was one thing, but now you actually have a solid relationship with the city of Fort Lauderdale and have actually gone so far as to make the beer of Fort Lauderdale, everything under the sun.
Yeah.
How did that conversation get started? Because obviously you aren't the only brewery here. Right. They could have gone with anybody, but we
started hosting events for Broward County, actually, not just the city, a while ago. I mean, I can't even tell you the first one. It was probably pre-pandemic, actually, and that it was a conversation that kind of took off. I mean, it wasn't one of those things that we talked about and then it died away. It's something that both parties were interested in doing, and we went through renditions of what the label would look like, what type of beer we wanted to make, and all that, and we decided to come up with a Hefeweizen, and that it also does really well.
Now, I was going to say, what was that process like, especially as people who may not necessarily know beer, like Fort Lauderdale commissioners, to create, hey, this is the beer that you want, even though you don't necessarily know these things as much.
Yeah. Again, I think it stems on doing something maybe a little bit different. That is, a lot of these conversations happened before I was a managing partner. So my business partner was the managing partner before I bought him out 2 years ago. So a lot of these conversations happened before I took over. But, making it like a light lager, it's not going to really set it apart, from, say whatever.
Yeah, there's so many light lagers
going to be on, or Coors is going to be on tap. So doing something a little bit different that is still palatable and people from all kind of walks of life can enjoy, because it's not a real boozy offering. I think it's like 5%, I think, but it has like banana clove notes, and it's got a wheat base, so it's kind of got a little more of a silky mouthfeel to it. So it definitely speaks to a large mass of people too, and it's a little different than somebody that doesn't know beer. They'd try it and be like, oh, I love it. What's that?
Interesting. And it's got the sort of placement around town to where people will, even the locals that may not necessarily know Gulf Stream, will come in.
Yes.
Awesome. Beer-wise, what are the next couple steps for Gulf Stream that you see?
Well, again, our Gulf Stream's distribution's kind of become its own animal, right? So we were trying to really focus on the tap room for a long time, and we still are. The distribution is really taking off quite a bit. Nice. So currently we're looking at expanding our production in order to be able to open up more counties in the state and increase our platform there. But, the reason why we want to do that is because we want to keep our variety at the tap room and our ability to keep, rotating new beers and all that on and not take up all our capacity into making production beers. So that's the next step, and we're currently working on that now.
Awesome.
It's true.
So there we are with part 2 of our 3-part episode at Gulf Stream. We've talked about the food, we've talked about the beer, and now we get to talk about the spirits. And that's going to be our next episode. So definitely follow us on social media so you can find when that episode drops. And the best place to do that is on Instagram or Threads or X or Blue Sky. We are at Florida Beer Blog. We are FL Beer Blog on Facebook. You can find us at floridabeerblog.com or floridabeerpodcast.com. And you can always reach out to us very easily at floridabeerblog@gmail.com. If you are going to Champions Beer Fest at the Big Easy Casino on Saturday, September 21st, you will see us there, including some amazing Florida breweries and distilleries that we have featured on the podcast before. If you see me around with the audio equipment, make sure to stop and say hi and use Florida Beer Blog as your code when purchasing tickets for $10 off. Trust me, it's going to be a good time. If you are not following us on the podcasting app of your choice, please make sure to do so. We are on Apple Podcasts, we're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, we're on Amazon Podcasts. You can ask your favorite home smart speaker to play the Florida Beer Podcast, and our latest episode will come up. And when you listen, you'll notice that we are a proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, a collection of amazing Florida-based podcasts here in the Sunshine State that I recommend that you listen to. You can find more information about them at floridapodcastnetwork.com. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich, field producer is Steve Pekala, executive producer of the Florida Podcast Network in Grand Hyatt Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. This is David Butler, your host and author. Thank you so much for listening. We will be back at Gulf Stream for one more week in our next episode. Thank you so much, and drink Florida Craft.